See my screen?
Yep. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, as Jack told you, recently I was asked to give a presentation to the chief and deputy chief regarding their Cherokee ancestries. Kinley Henson hooked me up with this. She's Maxine Hamilton's granddaughter. Everybody who's been in Going Snake a long time knows her. And she said she wanted it similarly to Dr. Henry Louis Gates' program, Finding Your Roots. And I spent a lot of time working on these, not so much in the research of the ancestries, but rather in gathering and presenting the documents that I showed. These documents were aired in January on YouTube. At the end of the videos, I was indicated as being a producer. However, I don't think I ever acted in that capacity. Rather, I was more of an actor. The filmings lasted about 30 minutes and were done in November. But the final products were edited down to about 12 minutes. I guess they thought the internet was going to fill up and they didn't want to have more on there than they could handle. So after the filming, I was never contacted during the editing. One of my objectives was to explain the history surrounding the creation of the documents I was presenting. However, especially in regard to the chief's video, most of my history was edited out. So Jack asked me to present it here. Now, during a period of almost 70 years, from 1838 to 1907, which is an incredibly short time, some of us here are older than that now, the citizens of the Cherokee Nation went through 3 events, each of which greatly altered their history and affected everyone living in the nation. First, in 1838 and 39, the forced removal from the eastern homelands in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina, and the difficulties of resettlement and reunion in the Indian Territory. Secondly, the Civil War involved the entire Cherokee Nation. Disruption and devastation in the nation was as great during the war as in any state. Thirdly, just prior to the Oklahoma statehood in 1907, enrollment and allotment changed the Cherokee relationship to the very land where they lived. Now, at this point, I began by discussing Cherokee ancestors, focusing on these 3 events and working backwards. I'll mention, but not go into much detail regarding some of the ancestors. First, we'll review enrollment and allotment. Enrollment and allotment in the tribal nations in Indian Territory had been discussed frequently since the Civil War. During the 3 decades since then, the nation had made substantial progress in digging itself out of the trauma of the war, especially in regard to its development of education advancements and social institutions such as orphanages and indigent facilities. In the post-Civil War treaty with the United States in 1866, the nation was guaranteed that it would be protected from unauthorized intruders who moved into the nation to take advantage of the Cherokee customs regarding land usage. However, if you review the documents produced by the chiefs of the nation during the years immediately following, you will find many requests to the United States government to enforce this provision, almost always without success. Consequently, a larger and larger number of United States citizens began residing in the nation illegally, and they were an important group pushing for statehood in the Indian Territory. These non-citizens had no access to Cherokee government schools or land or improvement ownerships, and as evidenced by the census of 1900, certainly over half of the inhabitants living in the Cherokee Nation were intruders. In 1893, Congress established the Dawes Commission with the intent of agreeing with the tribal nations to end their governments, cede their land, and allow individual ownership. Prior to this time, the Cherokees had always recognized communal ownership of the land. Any unused land was available to any citizen to set up a residence and begin farming or other commercial activities. The objectives of the commission were twofold. First was to determine and enroll all of the citizens of the 5 tribes, and secondly, to allot the land areas of the 5 tribal nations to the individual citizens in anticipation of statehood. This was a monumental task, especially due to the fact that in the case of the Cherokee, and I'm not familiar with the other tribes, a large portion of the citizens, perhaps 20%, were opposed to allotment and refused to provide information to the enrolling commissioners. But the commission used prior Cherokee censuses made in 1880 and 1896 and traveled to rural areas to obtain testimony from relatives and neighbors to record all eligible persons. And while there are many examples of children born since 1896 whose enrollment was overlooked, as far as adults, I have found fewer than 5 eligible individuals who did not get enrolled. Stories we hear today about those who refused to be enrolled because they did not want to claim to be Indian or for various other reasons are total myths. In its objective of determining citizenship, the commission was quite successful in the Cherokee Nation. Now, the chief had 4 ancestors enrolled by Dawes. The deputy chief had 12 Cherokee ancestors and 1 intermarried citizen. Here is the Dawes census card for the chief's great-grandparents, Ned and Nellie Hoskin. I told the chief that it appears that the name was originally written as Hoskins, but that the final S was erased. And he commented that people are still doing that today. He doesn't seem to have a hang up about people referring to him as Hoskins rather than Hoskin. Now, the Dawes cutoff for the Cherokee enrollment was originally September the 1st, 1902, and any Cherokee Nation citizen living on that date should theoretically have been enrolled. However, an act of Congress reopened the rolls to include minors born from that date through March the 4th, 1906. This is the deputy chief's great-grandfather's card enrolled as a minor on card 2834. Now here I want to discuss one of the deputy chief's ancestors, John Tidwell from Stillwell. He was one of the oldest Cherokee citizens enrolled by Dawes at age 85. Here's a page from his testimony given to the commission in July of 1900. And here is his accompanying census card. Now, John did not come west during the forced removal, but he remained in Georgia, probably because his mother was a white woman. After the Civil War, the Cherokee government began actively encouraging those remaining in the East to come to the Cherokee Nation and be readmitted as citizens, and many hundreds did so. John came to the Cherokee Nation in 1889 after having made application for readmittance the previous year, and this approval allowed him to be enrolled by Dawes. Now, a couple of pages, this is a couple of pages from his readmittance, and it indicates his father was named Awinita or Young Deer, and that Young Deer's sister was Sokini, also known as Susanna, the wife of William Hendricks. Now, John Tidwell had 16 children, and many thousands of Cherokees today are descended from him. Now, these readmittance testimonies are quite numerous, many rolls of microfilm, tens of thousands of pages perhaps. But there's also a lot of fraud involved in some of the testimony that's being given. So don't necessarily believe everything you read in these testimonies. Now, besides enrollment, the Dawes Commission was tasked with allotting the land to the enrolled citizens. Of course, land could not be allotted randomly because each family had a homestead and improvements which to the extent possible needed to be allotted to the head of the family. The allotment packets have been digitized and are online at Fold 3. And while they're a little difficult to use, it should be possible to find exact land allotted to each citizen. Here's the allotment map from one packet indicating the land being allotted. Most families did not get contiguous land, especially for children. Much of their allotted lands would necessarily have to be in other locations where settlement in the nation was sparser, perhaps far away from remaining family members. The parents frequently elected to take money in lieu of land for their children. And in its second objective of land allotment to the citizens, the Dawes Commission was perhaps less successful, probably due to circumstances beyond its control. Because of the large number of citizens who were opposed to allotment, it was difficult to pinpoint the exact homesteads for each family and allot the lands to the heads of the families. My understanding, just in the back of my mind, is that the Dawes Commission had some detailed maps, but I've never seen them unless they're talking about these township maps that are in the land allotment packets like I'm showing here. The difficulties created in later generations from misallotting some of the land after the death of the original enrollees have been studied by Dr. Rose Strimlaw in her book, Sustaining the Cherokee Family. Now here, out of the allotment packet, is the legal description for 3 members of the Hoskin family, as summarized by the Dawes Commission. You see here, it gives the exact location, and I believe the number of acres of where all of this land is. Now you can start looking there, and then here is a current map I was able to create online by using the range and township data showing the location of the Ned Hoskin allotment of 100 homestead allotment. This was of 130 acres east of Veneta, where this blue dot is. Somebody's okay. The Will Rogers Turnpike runs through this area right now. You can see here. This was a free website that I just found while I was working on this talk, called randymajors.org. And I think you can go to that website, plug in the township range and everything, and it will give you a current map of exactly where that is. Now, although I don't believe it was known at the time of the enrollment, land for those indicated as being half-blood or more was restricted and tax exempt. And here's a document that was in the allotment packet that shows an indication of the tax exempt status of the land of Ned and Nellie Hoskin in 1930, quite a bit later than allotment time. Now notice Ned signed his own document here. Nellie was deceased at that time, and her document was signed by a BIA officer. Now we'll move back to discuss the period around the Civil War. In the decade before the war, the Cherokee Nation was well on its way to a recovery from the turmoil created by the forced removal and its aftermath. But the Civil War temporarily halted all of these advancements and left large-scale destruction and death throughout the nation. The war had been as devastating to the individual citizens and the government structure in the Cherokee Nation as in any state, especially because there were substantial numbers of Cherokees enlisted on each side. Most of the Confederate supporters consisted of mixed blood citizens, among which nearly all of the slaveholders were found, and the Union supporters consisted of more traditional or full-blood Cherokees. The enlistments of many full-blood Cherokees in the conflict was one major reason that citizens began to be recognized with both a given name and a surname. And that practice was basically standard by the time of the 1880 census. I believe that a dissertation on the acceptance of surnames by traditional Cherokees would be a great subject to study. Now, the chief had at least two ancestors, and perhaps a third, who served the Union in the Civil War as members of the Indian Home Guard. The deputy chief had three ancestors in the Home Guards and a fourth who served the Confederacy, though not in an Indian Territory regiment. That was Mansell Tidwell, the son of John we mentioned previously, who fought for the Confederacy. He was still living in Georgia at the outbreak of the war. Of course, Confederate veterans were not eligible for federal pensions, but many Southern states, including Oklahoma, awarded state pensions to former Confederate soldiers, and Mansell received a pension in Alabama and died there in 1917. Here is his name on this list. Notice his pension indicates he was wounded at Murfreesboro. Now, the Oklahoma Confederate pension applications are quite numerous and are digitized and online at the Oklahoma Historical Society website. After the war, widows and orphans of those killed who were members of the Indian Home Guard started applying for pensions. In the 1890s, veteran soldiers still living began to apply for themselves to receive invalid and indigent pensions. Most of the pension records have not been microfilmed or digitized. There's a small percentage of Indian Home Guard widow pensions on Fold 3, but I don't believe any of the soldiers' pensions are on there yet. Now, an interesting pension is one for John Hoskin, who was enlisted under the name John Horseskin. Jack reviewed this pension once when he was at the National Archives and says it consists of many hundreds of pages, over 2 or 3 big files, probably because there was some dispute regarding who was his widow. And because of this effort, we have access to some of the pertinent pages from this person. Here is John's initial affidavit for a pension. Notice he indicates down here he had rheumatism and that he was unable to support himself and uses crutches and is forced to rely on the charities of others. Now, the amounts received by the soldiers who obtained these pensions was initially $8 a month. Now, I want to discuss John's family a little bit here before we continue because it's so interesting. In 1906, the immigrant Cherokees, those who still lived in the East in the 1835 at the time of the treaty, won a court case against the United States, which resulted in per capita payment to all persons who were citizens of the Cherokee Nation East at the time of the 1835 treaty and their descendants. Now, we're very lucky. We've all seen these applications many times. We're very lucky that John Hoskin was still living. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be able to determine anything about his ancestry. And he made an application for the funds due him. This application and a review of other records allows us to identify John's parents as Lieutenant Charles Hoskins, a white man who had been to West Point, and Lucy Prince. Now, the Prince surname is given erroneously in the applications as French. You'll see it listed right here, that this was his uncle Walker French. I believe that the use of the name French rather than Prince was a misunderstanding by an English-speaking scribe who made out this form. And you see here, John claims for his uncle Walker French. Now, if we turn to this page here, this allows us to see John enrolled with his mother and stepfather on the 1851 Drennan Roll in the Delaware District, Group 996. You see Lucy right here, and John is listed under his Cherokee name of Kanunu, which means bullfrog. The Drennan Roll was a payment made subsequent to the Treaty of 1846 with the intention of soothing over some of the difficulties and divisions resulting in the forced removal. Now, remember, we saw Walker Prince as a person that John claimed to be an heir of. And if you look in this group before Lucy, you'll see an Adoe Prince. An Adoe, which I know from my experience of doing genealogy, means walker. And that's what allowed me to determine that the French and Prince names were garbled. And Adowie here, or Walker Prince, is living next to his sister Lucy. Now here I want to discuss the ancestors in the East. The deputy chief had one old settler ancestor, or an old settler family, but the chief did not. Cherokee families had begun to move away from the eastern homeland in the 1790s, settling west of the Mississippi, generally in northeast Arkansas, and eventually congregating near Russellville. These persons are generally known today as old settlers. Previously, they had been referred to as Arkansas Cherokees or Western Cherokees. In the treaties between the United States and the Cherokee in 1817 and 19, the old settlers were given title to their land in Arkansas, and they began to develop governmental institutions separate from the Eastern government. To consider the old settlers as one group is really a misnomer. The records of those immigrating prior to 1817 are practically non-existent, but they were the first segment of old settlers. Especially after the enactment of the treaties, many more Cherokees were induced to remove west to Arkansas, and they were in the second segment, and there are a few records which name them. In 1828, the old settlers treated separately with the United States, giving up their land in Arkansas and receiving title to what is now the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. After their move in 1829, many more Cherokees began moving west voluntarily, this time to what's now Oklahoma. And this would have been the third wave of old settlers. And we have a reasonable conglomeration of records regarding these people. A census was conducted of the entire Cherokee Nation East in 1835, naming the heads of the Cherokee families and numbering their family members in age and gender groupings. Now, here's one page from that census, which indicates the chief's ancestor, Lucy Prince. Her family is shown as consisting of one full blood and 5 mixed Negroes. I would think it very likely the full blood was her mother. Lucy was living in McMinn County, Tennessee, the portion which later became Bradley County, where the Cherokee Agency was located. On December the 29th of that year, a minority political faction in the Cherokee Nation, usually now referred to as the Treaty Party or Ridge Party, signed a removal treaty in New Echota. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty the following May, and it was used as the legal justification for the forced removal 2 years later. After the ratification, the United States sent agents throughout the Cherokee Nation to value the real estate improvements of the individual citizens. Of course, the land was owned in common by the nation, but things such as houses, barns, fences, fruit trees, and ferries were valued, and the amounts were paid to the individuals out of the $5 million compensation provided in the treaty. Various persons, generally who are members of the Trail of Tears Association, have been attempting to digitize, index, disseminate these valuations and other documents associated with removal. So it has been, in recent years, it's been possible to find and review these documents for nearly all Cherokee citizens living in the East during the removal time. Now, the persons who are helping to organize these discoveries are Michael Wren, Jack Baker, Curtis Rohr, Marybelle Chase, Wanda Elliott, Troy Wayne Poteet, and others. And I think all of them are here today except for Troy Wayne. Now, I went into some detail with both chiefs regarding their ancestors in the East and the circumstances of how they removed west, and also into Chief Hoskins' white ancestor, Lieutenant Charles Hoskins, who graduated from West Point in 1836 and was immediately assigned to the Cherokee Nation to assist in the forced removal. Somehow he hooked up with Lucy Prince to produce the chief's ancestor, John Hoskins. And I'm not going to go into detail here. There's more detail in the video with the chief, but it's an interesting turn of events. Now, I haven't gotten much feedback from my presentation, as you might have imagined. One reason, I think, is that they were edited to such a degree, leaving out the history, that they didn't connect with most Cherokees. If these weren't your ancestors that we were discussing, why should you care? During the presentation to the deputy chief, I indicated that one of his ancestors, a full-blood whom we generally know today as Dick Easky, was a signer of the removal treaty in 1835. On this page, we see the second name on the treaty as being Dickaeski. For many years, I thought this was Dickaeski, but I reviewed it again. Now, there's an indication in the 1842 claims that Dickaeski, or at least his family, came on the Mose Daniel detachment. And I thought that was odd that a treaty signer would have come west on a Ross detachment. But two things convinced me that this was the same person. One was that Dick Easky's son, Andrew, married a daughter of James Starr, another treaty signer. The other was the name. I had asked Michael to help me search for anyone else with a similar name, and we came up empty. However, there's a descendant of Dick Easky who is furious with me that I indicated, without proper documentation in their view, that he was a treaty signer, and it was demanded that I issue a public retraction. I'm not sure whether she's upset with shoddy research or is upset that she may be a descendant of a treaty signer. Having the same name in a small group of persons like the Cherokee Nation and not finding anyone else with a similar name goes a long way, in my view, toward believing it's the same person. And while some persons try, most of us are not successful in selecting our ancestors. Now, here's the chart I produced for the deputy chief. And here's the chart that I produced for the principal chief. Okay, that concludes my talk. If anybody has any questions, I can answer them.
That's a good job, Dave.